All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to be starting module 3.2. So this is continuing our conversation about ecosystem ecology. And now what we're really going to be focusing on is the downstream effects of major biological processes that influence ecosystems. The key one being climate change. So if you think back to our last lecture where we looked at beetle size and how beetles were changing with warming temperatures, that's the type of systems we're going to be starting to think about in this lecture. So one of the examples that your book gives is looking at how temperature cues seasonal tasks in plants, such as mating or producing flowers. And you're going to see a video looking specifically at synchrony of flowering plants and bees in alpine environments. Here we're going to be looking at an example of mean spring temperature and the average first flowering date for flowers. And you can see that as time has gone on and as spring temperature has increased, we see that the date of the flowering of different plants is getting earlier and earlier. And what I want you to think as we sort of go through these different examples is, okay, so we're seeing a direct effect of one species or one community and this larger idea of climate change, and think about how we might think of downstream effects that this might cause for other species. This is looking at another example where we're looking at what our projected plant distribution is going to look like in the particularly the Northeast. So you can see that this is a map looking at all the different forest types and dominant tree types that we see in the Northeast. And this is what gives us such colorful falls and is a big source of tourism for us. But when we look at what's projected for the distribution of these forests, we can see that a lot of these plants are no longer going to be the primary or dominant plant within these forests. And again, we need to think about how that might influence downstream effects. You know, obviously there's an economic effect for the Northeast. We wouldn't have those beautiful falls, and so we'd have fewer peepers coming out. But also think about how this change could influence downstream effects for the different species that rely on these other species of plant. We can zoom out even further and look at an example of looking at different bird species. So this is a great example of citizen science. So every year, there's something called the annual Audubon Christmas bird count, where people go out and count the number of species of birds that they see. And they've been doing this for a very, very long time. And we can actually use that data set to look at how bird populations are changing over time. And we can see that birds have dramatically changed in terms of where they thrive and where they choose to migrate. And these changes have profound effects on the insect populations. So because the migration of birds going more and more north as climate change happens, it potentially leaves forests vulnerable to parasitic caterpillars that eat and kill trees. Again, thinking about how these different species interact with one another is the big hallmark of ecosystem ecology. One of the critical things when we're talking about climate change and understanding the dynamics of climate change is understanding how we actually measure it. So when we're talking about present day carbon dioxide levels, we're measuring them directly from the air. And these are constantly observed by NOAA and other government agencies that are really looking at the carbon dioxide that's present in the air. And you can see that this is the rapid term and climb of CO2 levels since we've been measuring in the 1960s. But when we start talking about historic carbon levels, the main way that we observe these is looking at historical ice cores. So we basically go into the Arctic and we dig down to these giant ice cores, and we're able to date those very specifically. And importantly, within these ice cores, we actually are able to isolate gas bubbles that are trapped in the ice cores, and that can be analyzed for the carbon level at that time. And that's what allows us to create this long-scale analysis of how carbon has been cycling for a long time. It also gives us a giant clue into understanding whether or not humans are the primary drivers of climate change. And what we're able to do is we're able to look at the isotopes and the type of carbon that's present. And the type of carbon that's present currently is an isotope that's only found in human-derived substances. So that's one of the main pieces of evidence that shows us that yes, climate change is real, and climate change is being driven by humans. So when we're talking about these cycles, and again, this is just sort of, I want us to be able to sort of think through the different cyclings that are happening in environments and how one cycle might affect another cycle, or how one impact might affect another. Again, these are the big questions of ecosystem ecology. And so I'd like you to go ahead and pause on this image if you can, and take a look at this and sort of understand the cycle that's happening. I'm not wanting you to memorize this cycle or anything like that, but I want you to understand how, for example, deforestation or land use might influence the carbon cycles, and think through how an ecosystem ecologist might ask questions about how deforestation might impact, for example, dead marine life circulating in the ocean. How would we maybe connect those dots, and understanding how those dots might connect globally. Now, carbon's not the only element that cycles in the environment. Again, you probably already are well aware that there are other elements that are cycling constantly in the environment. But what I'd like you to just take a note on is, again, understanding how one section of this might influence another. And again, sort of understanding that, yes, elements are cycling, but specifically, how does one area impact another? Another example is phosphorus, a structure that's critical for DNA, ATP, RNA, phospholipids. And again, this is another cycle thing that's happening. So being able to understand, for example, how fertilizer, again, might go ahead and influence composition of composers in the soil, for example. Understanding how these different boxes might impact one another are the primary questions that ecosystem ecologists try and ask. So just to give you a quick summary of what we went through, temperature is an important physical part of an ecosystem, and we see that there are many downstream effects that temperature has on ecosystems. And climate change is dramatically impacting these ecosystems, and through a myriad of ways and pathways. And lastly, carbon isn't the only important element that's cycling through our ecosystems. There are various cycles that can potentially impact how ecosystems thrive. All right, I'll see you back for Module 3.3.